The marble walls of the House Judiciary Committee hearing room shimmered under the relentless glare of television lights. Every seat was filled. Reporters clutching notepads, aides whispering behind stacks of papers, and members of Congress preparing for what had been billed as a routine session on judicial ethics. Yet nothing about this day would be routine. At the center of it all sat Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, a figure whose very presence commanded attention. Decades of power and prestige rested easily on his shoulders. He leaned back in his chair, the faintest trace of a smile on his face, radiating the kind of confidence that comes from 32 years on the nation's highest court. Across the polished table, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone. Her royal purple suit stood out boldly against the oak-paneled backdrop, an unmistakable signal that she hadn't come to fade into the background. The murmurs in the gallery quieted as she shuffled her papers, her composure revealing nothing of the storm gathering beneath. Just moments earlier, when the committee chair had introduced her, Thomas had leaned toward a fellow justice seated behind him and whispered, audibly enough for the cameras in the front row to catch, "Let's see if the Congresswoman actually knows anything about constitutional law." A soft chuckle followed, rippling through the Republican members seated nearby. The laughter hadn't gone unnoticed. Crockett, though outwardly calm, felt every ounce of its condescension. She had faced this tone before. Judges who mistook youth for naivety, men who mistook politeness for weakness. What Thomas didn't know was that she had spent years studying his opinions, dissecting his logic, and tracing the inconsistencies that wove through his jurisprudence like invisible threads. This was not going to be another unchallenged appearance. The chair gavelled the room to order. The committee recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, for her questions. Crockett leaned forward, voice steady but strong. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Justice Thomas, thank you for appearing before us today. I'd like to focus my questions on judicial ethics and consistency in legal reasoning." Thomas nodded, his trademark half-smile still present, the air of superiority undisturbed. "Of course, Congresswoman," he replied smoothly, his tone laced with an almost imperceptible mockery. "You've long identified yourself as an originalist, a textualist who believes in interpreting the Constitution strictly according to its original meaning. Is that correct?" "I would say that's accurate," Thomas answered, his baritone voice resonating through the chamber. "I interpret the Constitution as it was written, not as some wish it to be." "Then," Crockett continued, "you've also been critical of justices who, in your view, have strayed from those principles?" "When the court departs from the text or the framers' intent," Thomas said, "I've made my disagreement known." Crockett nodded thoughtfully, her tone measured. "Then perhaps you can help me reconcile something. In Shelby County versus Holder, you joined the majority in striking down key provisions of the Voting Rights Act, arguing that the coverage formula was based on outdated data. Yet the 15th Amendment explicitly grants Congress the power to enforce protections against racial discrimination in voting. How does invalidating congressional authority explicitly provided by the Constitution align with your originalist philosophy?" The faint smile on Thomas's face faltered. "If you'd read my opinion, Congresswoman," he said, "you'd understand that the formula was based on 40-year-old data, hardly reflective of current realities. The Constitution doesn't allow Congress to restrict states indefinitely based on outdated information." Several Republicans nodded approvingly. They'd heard this defense before. "I have read your opinion," Crockett replied coolly. "More than once. But what I find interesting is how that reasoning contrasts with your dissent in Obergefell versus Hodges, where you wrote, and I quote, "The Constitution contains no dignity clause, and even if it did, the government would be incapable of bestowing dignity." A low murmur swept through the audience. Thomas shifted slightly in his chair. "My question is this," she continued. "How do you reconcile invalidating congressional authority explicitly enumerated in the 15th Amendment, while dismissing rights recognized by the court under the 14th? Doesn't that suggest your adherence to originalism is applied selectively?" Thomas's eyes narrowed. "That's a gross mischaracterization of my judicial record, Congresswoman." These are nuanced legal issues that, frankly, require a level of constitutional understanding that comes with experience. The condescension was unmistakable. Before Crockett could reply, a Republican committee member interjected, "Mr. Chairman, the witness should be allowed to respond without these gotcha questions." The chairman banged the gavel. "Order! The Congresswoman has the floor." Crockett smiled faintly, turning back to Thomas. "Justice Thomas, I haven't interrupted you once. My question is about the consistency of your stated judicial philosophy with your record." The tension in the room was now electric. Every reporter leaned forward. Cameras zoomed closer. Even the committee aides had stopped typing. "In District of Columbia versus Heller," Crockett continued, "you joined a majority opinion recognizing an individual right to bear arms, something not explicitly stated in the Second Amendment, which references a well-regulated militia. How does that square with your claim that rights must be explicitly enumerated in the text?" Thomas let out a low, dismissive laugh. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, this demonstrates exactly what I suspected. A fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional interpretation. The framers' intent behind the Second Amendment was clear. The individual right is implicit in the structure of the text." Crockett didn't blink. "And yet, Justice Thomas, when it comes to voting rights, where the Constitution explicitly empowers Congress, you found the text insufficient." A few members of the audience gasped. Softly, Thomas's smile vanished. "Completely," Crockett continued, voice calm but firm. "In Trump versus Anderson, you argued that states cannot add qualifications for federal candidates beyond those enumerated in the Constitution. But in your dissent in Arizona State Legislature versus Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission, you wrote that states have broad authority to regulate elections. How do you reconcile those positions?" Thomas's patience thinned. "There is no contradiction for those who understand constitutional law," he snapped. "Perhaps if you had more experience—" "Justice Thomas," Crockett interrupted, her tone still level but carrying unmistakable steel. "I practiced constitutional law for over a decade before coming to Congress. I've litigated voting rights cases across multiple jurisdictions. I assure you, I understand the Constitution very well." The room fell silent. For the first time, Thomas's composure slipped. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted briefly toward his Republican allies for support. None came. Crockett took a slow breath and turned a page in her notes. "Let's move to judicial ethics." A visible tension rippled through the chamber. Everyone knew what that meant. The question of Ginny Thomas, the justice's politically active wife. Thomas straightened in his chair. "Congresswoman, my ethical record speaks for itself. I've served for 32 years with integrity." "Then you won't mind addressing specifics," she said, sliding a document across the table. "In 2011, you said you inadvertently omitted your wife's income from the Heritage Foundation on financial disclosure forms, an omission that lasted 5 years and involved hundreds of thousands of dollars. Was that really inadvertent?" The justice's face reddened. "My wife's career is independent of my judicial duties. These insinuations are nothing but political theater." The Republican members erupted. "Mr. Chairman, this is out of line," one shouted. "This is harassment." The gavel struck again. "Order. The witness will answer the question." Thomas glared across the table. "I've addressed these matters previously. My disclosures met all legal requirements." Crockett nodded slowly. "And you've stated that you and your wife never discuss court cases. Yet records show she communicated directly with senior White House officials about efforts to overturn the 2020 election, while cases related to that very issue were pending before you. In fact, you were the only justice to dissent when the court allowed the release of Trump White House records to the January 6th committee. How do you explain that?" The words hit the room like a shockwave. Thomas's tone hardened. "Congresswoman, these accusations are beneath the dignity of this committee." "What's beneath the dignity of our institutions?" Crockett shot back, her voice rising just enough to command the room. "Is a Supreme Court justice laughing at a member of Congress asking legitimate questions about ethics and accountability?" Gasps echoed across the chamber. For the first time, Thomas appeared visibly shaken. His dismissive smirk, so present at the start, had vanished completely. His eyes met hers, and for the first time it was clear. She had control of the room. Crockett leaned forward. "Justice Thomas, earlier, you seemed confident that this hearing would be a formality. But I've spent my entire legal career studying your opinions, your reasoning, your inconsistencies, your ethical blind spots, and today, I'm holding you to the same standard you've demanded of others." She reached into her folder and pulled out a thick, bound report, sliding it across the table with deliberate precision. "I'd like to enter into the record an independent analysis of your voting. Record in cases involving amicus briefs filed by organizations affiliated with your wife. According to this data, you've aligned with those groups' positions every single time. That's a 100% correlation. Would you care to explain why you've never once recused yourself in such cases?" A collective murmur filled the room. Reporters exchanged stunned looks. Even Thomas's allies appeared uncertain. Thomas blinked, momentarily speechless. "I'm not familiar with that document," he finally said. "Any suggestion that my wife's affiliations influence my decisions is offensive and false." "This isn't suggestion, Justice Thomas," Crockett replied evenly. "It's documentation." The analysis was conducted by independent judicial ethics scholars from Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. No other justice in modern history has demonstrated such a perfect correlation between spouse affiliation and judicial outcome. The gallery erupted in whispers. Journalists began typing furiously, cameras flashing from every angle. Thomas's shoulders stiffened. His jaw clenched. "These are baseless attacks." "Then refute them," Crockett said simply. He didn't. The silence that followed was deafening. Crockett pressed on. "In Republican Party of Minnesota versus White, 2002, you wrote that judges must avoid even the appearance of bias, that integrity requires recusal whenever impartiality could reasonably be questioned. Those were your words, Justice Thomas, not mine. Yet you dismiss those very principles when they apply to yourself." For a moment, Thomas looked utterly still. Then, slowly, his eyes dropped to the table. The committee chair glanced at the clock but made no move to cut Crockett off. Everyone in the room understood. History was being made in real time. She turned the final page of her notes. "Justice Thomas, I'd like to ask about one last matter." Thomas exhaled sharply. "Proceed." "These," Crockett said, unfolding another sheet, "are text messages between your wife and former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, urging him to stand firm in overturning the 2020 election results. Under oath, you claimed you had no knowledge of these communications." Thomas's voice rose. "I was not aware of the content of my wife's private messages." "Interesting," Crockett replied, "because these phone records show a 13-minute call between your personal cell phone and Mr. Meadows on the same day those messages were sent." The room exploded in gasps. Thomas froze, his composure disintegrating. "Congresswoman, I'm not going to dignify this with a response." Crockett leaned back, her expression calm and unshaken. "When you laughed at the beginning of my questioning, you assumed I wasn't prepared. You assumed I didn't understand the Constitution. But today, Justice Thomas, I didn't come to play politics. I came to hold power accountable." She gathered her notes, closing her folder deliberately. "That laughter said more about your judgment than about my experience. For someone who speaks so often about impartiality, you revealed quite a bit of bias before I even asked a single question." The chamber was silent. Thomas sat motionless, his face pale, the weight of the exchange settling around him like an unwelcome verdict. "I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman," Crockett concluded. "Justice Thomas's responses, or lack thereof, speak for themselves." As she leaned back in her chair, several members of the audience, unable to contain themselves, rose to their feet and began to applaud. The chairman's gavel struck repeatedly for order, but it was too late. The moment had been captured from every angle. For the first time in his long career, Justice Clarence Thomas looked cornered, and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had just rewritten the rules of congressional oversight. The hearing room emptied slowly, like a theater audience reluctant to leave after a breathtaking performance. The echo of applause and gavel strikes still lingered in the air. Outside the chamber, reporters swarmed, their voices colliding in a chaotic blur of breaking news alerts and rapid-fire commentary. Within minutes, every major network had cut to live coverage. "Unprecedented confrontation on Capitol Hill," announced the CNN anchor, her tone a mixture of disbelief and awe. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas just delivered one of the most pointed interrogations ever directed at a sitting Supreme Court justice. Clips of the exchange looped endlessly. Crockett leaning forward, her voice steady, Thomas blinking under the lights, momentarily speechless. The moment she said, "That laughter said more about your judgment than about my experience." That line went viral within minutes. Hashtag surged. Crockett TV as Thomas. Ethics on trial. Accountability. Matters. On X. Journalists, lawyers, and everyday Americans flooded timelines with commentary. That was a masterclass in composure and command. Jasmine Crockett just made history. The balance of power feels different tonight. For the first time, a Supreme Court justice looked answerable, not untouchable. Inside the Capitol, Thomas's team moved quickly. Aides and legal advisors huddled in side rooms, drafting statements and coordinating with friendly media outlets. The plan was simple: portray the hearing as a political ambush. But the problem was bigger than spin. The documents Crockett entered into the record were now public, and they were devastating. The 87-page report detailing the 100% alignment between Thomas's votes and his wife's affiliated organizations became the centerpiece of a national debate. Law professors dissected it on air. Editorial boards demanded explanations. Even some conservative commentators, usually defenders of Thomas, hesitated. "Optics matter," one said on Fox News that night. And today, those optics were catastrophic. By evening, Crockett's face dominated every news broadcast. MSNBC ran a chyron that read, "The cross-examination that shook the court." ABC called it a watershed moment for judicial accountability. Even the New York Times described the exchange as the most consequential congressional interrogation of a Supreme Court justice since Watergate. Clips of Thomas fumbling for answers replayed in endless slow motion. His words, "Perhaps if you had more experience," became a meme overnight, contrasted with Crockett's calm stare and flawless rebuttal. On TikTok, young creators spliced her lines into remixes, pairing her takedown with cinematic music. But while social media celebrated, the political machine stirred uneasily. Republicans accused Democrats of demeaning the judiciary. Senator Josh Hawley declared, "This was not oversight. It was a show trial." Yet even within conservative circles, whispers began to spread. Some GOP strategists worried that Thomas had been too visibly rattled, too dismissive, too human. And on Capitol Hill, whispers grew into something larger, a movement to formalize a Supreme Court code of conduct, long resisted by the justices themselves. The next morning, the Supreme Court building stood quiet and solemn beneath a gray Washington sky. The marble columns, usually symbols of serene authority, now seemed to echo with unease. Inside, clerks avoided the press. Justices moved through side corridors to dodge cameras. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was reportedly uncharacteristically silent during their private conference. Justice Sotomayor told a colleague, "This is exactly why the public doesn't trust us anymore." Chief Justice Roberts faced mounting pressure. In an unprecedented move, he released a statement. "While members of the court respect the oversight responsibilities of Congress, we remain confident in the ethical integrity of our institution. Recent public exchanges should not undermine that trust." But the words rang hollow. Editorial boards called the statement an evasion. Activists demanded independent oversight. Meanwhile, in the White House, senior advisors drafted talking points for the president. The question wasn't whether to comment, it was when. Crockett returned to her office, where a dozen bouquets of flowers now crowded her desk. Her staff buzzed with excitement. "You're trending everywhere," one aide said, showing her a phone. "You hit 5 million views in 2 hours." Crockett smiled faintly but didn't seem consumed by it. She sat down, removed her heels, and opened a folder labeled Judicial Reform Proposal. Draft. She'd already begun outlining legislation to establish an independent ethics review board for the Supreme Court. A measure proposed before but never taken seriously. This time felt different. The public was paying attention. That night, she appeared on the Rachel Maddow show. The host greeted her warmly. "Congresswoman, you didn't just ask questions, you changed the tone of the entire debate." Crockett smiled slightly. "I wasn't trying to create a moment. I was trying to demand accountability. If we can't hold the most powerful judges in the country to ethical standards, then what does justice even mean?" Her words resonated. Clips from the interview spread faster than the hearing itself. When she left the Capitol that night, protesters outside cheered her name. Banners read, "Ethics is not partisan." Crockett stood. Now we stand. For the first time in her career, she felt the magnitude of what she'd started. The backlash came quickly. Conservative commentators accused her of grandstanding. Anonymous op-eds questioned her legal competence. A political action committee aired attack ads in her home district, calling her a radical seeking to undermine the judiciary. But Crockett was prepared. She appeared the next morning on CNN's State of the Union, facing a skeptical interviewer. "Congresswoman, critics say your questioning of Justice Thomas was disrespectful. How do you respond?" She looked directly into the camera. "What's disrespectful is a justice mocking a member of Congress in a hearing about ethics. What's disrespectful is treating oversight as optional. My job is not to protect feelings. It's to protect the Constitution." The clip exploded online. Even her detractors privately admitted she was unflappable. 2 days later, The Washington Post dropped a bombshell. A leaked email revealed that Ginny Thomas had contacted several Republican lawmakers shortly after the 2020 election, urging them to support alternate electors in key swing states, and that she had forwarded some of those messages from her husband's official Supreme Court email account. The revelation detonated like a political earthquake. The House Ethics Committee announced a review. The Department of Justice confirmed it was evaluating the matter. By week's end, 3 senators, 2 Democrats and 1 independent, called for Justice Thomas to recuse himself from all election-related cases pending before the court. Suddenly, Crockett's questioning didn't look partisan. It looked prophetic. Inside the Supreme Court, tension was palpable. According to one clerk, Thomas's mood had darkened. "He's furious," the source said. "He thinks the hearing was a setup. He blames Roberts for not defending him." But Roberts, cautious as ever, focused on preserving legitimacy. In private, he told colleagues, "We can't afford to look above accountability. The public has limits." Justice Amy Coney Barrett quietly reached out to Crockett's office through back channels, requesting a private meeting about the proposed ethics bill. It was the first time in decades a sitting justice had sought dialogue with a member of Congress on reform. Something was shifting. 1 week later, Crockett took the House floor. Cameras rolled as she delivered what would later be described as the speech that redrew the line between branches of power. "Accountability," she said, her voice ringing through the chamber, "is not disrespect. Oversight is not an attack. When a justice can mock the very idea of answering questions from the people's representatives, our democracy is already in danger." She held up the ethics report again. "No one, no matter how robed, how titled, or how revered, is above transparency. Justice without accountability is not justice at all. It is privilege masquerading as law." Her words drew a standing ovation. Even some Republicans, cautious but compelled, joined in the applause. That night, newspapers across the country carried her photo on the front page. Congresswoman Crockett calls for Supreme Court ethics reform. A rising voice in a time of judicial crisis. In his chambers that night, Justice Thomas sat alone. The lights from the Capitol glowed faintly through the blinds. On his desk sat a stack of letters, some supportive, others condemning. He opened one, unsigned, written in neat cursive. "For decades, I looked up to you. But now, I see the cost of silence. Please remember that even the powerful must answer to truth." He read it twice before setting it aside. For the first time, the walls of the Supreme Court felt less like fortresses and more like mirrors. Within months, Crockett's bill, the Supreme Court Ethics and Transparency Act, gained bipartisan traction. The proposed law required justices to disclose spousal income in real time, recuse themselves from cases involving personal associations, and submit to independent review for potential conflicts of interest. When it passed the House by a narrow margin, Washington was stunned. As the Senate prepared to take it up, protesters gathered outside the Supreme Court. Some carried signs that read, "Power answers to the people." Crockett's law, check accountability. Crockett didn't celebrate publicly. She remained composed, focused, deliberate. She knew the battle wasn't over, but the culture had shifted. The once untouchable image of the Supreme Court had cracked, and in that fracture, the light of accountability began to shine through. Months later, in a televised interview, Jasmine Crockett reflected on that day in the hearing room. "When Justice Thomas laughed," she said softly, "I realized I wasn't just speaking to him, I was speaking to history. There are moments when silence becomes complicity." "I couldn't be silent." The interviewer leaned forward. "Do you think he'll ever answer your questions?" Crockett smiled faintly. "He already did." His silence said everything. The camera lingered as she looked off to the side, thoughtful yet resolute. Outside, the sun dipped behind the Capitol dome, casting long shadows over Washington. Something fundamental had changed. For the first time in generations, power had been forced to look in the mirror, and it was Jasmine Crockett, the Congresswoman from Texas, the lawyer who refused to be underestimated, who held that mirror up to history.